This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello, this is Breege Burke. Before we get into this week's podcast, I would like to thank my patrons personally. Politi, Jan H., Tanya T., Veronica S., Jeffrey B., Gabby, Helen M., Scott K., Sunny H., JRM, Susie G., B. Lupita, C. Roberts, Jeanette, DS, Jake B., CDV, Ali, V!V, Mary Beth R., Ida B., Eric N., Tana, May, Christine F., Alex C., Samantha G., Alcanet, Teddy O., and Desi Ray. I really appreciate those of you who have joined recently and who have stuck with me over these years. Our community is small, and there's so much I would like to do in terms of providing courses, conversation on the dark feminine, and extra content, so please consider joining at patreon.com/Chthonia. Now on to the podcast. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast dealing with the dark feminine. I'm Breege Burke, and our topic for this week is going to be Hermaphroditus. Now, this was a request. I had done Agdistis a long time ago, and somebody asked me, well, are you actually going to cover Hermaphroditus? Because this is another aspect of that idea of a dual-sexed being, or a masculine and feminine image that is merged into one, from which we get the term hermaphrodite, which often indicates a person who is intersexed or dual-sexed. And so I added that one to the list, and this is the point at which I want to discuss it. Now, this is an interesting topic because the story of Hermaphroditus, now the one that we know comes from Ovid's Metamorphoses, though there are other stories referring to hermaphrodites elsewhere, and we're going to look at those. Most notably, I'm thinking of Plato's Symposium, although Ovid also talks about the elements of chaos in the Fausti, and we're going to look a little bit at those things and about what the idea of a dual-sexed being actually means. So what I'm going to do is I want to structure this by looking first at the actual story. I'm going to read you the actual translation of the Ovid story that's on theoi.com and give you some of the background from there about who Hermaphroditus is. And then we're going to look at a couple of the different theories around Hermaphroditus and what his and hers eventually, what we can actually make of this merging, and what does it actually tell us about the uniting of the masculine and feminine. It's an interesting topic for me because right now, just a brief plug for the Institute for the Study of Feminine Myth, I have been very interested in the topic of masculine and feminine integration because I feel that far too much time has been spent on elements of patriarchy, on, toxic masculinity, women who have a different attitude towards men and towards relationships with men, and perhaps for very good reasons, men's response to that, and the way in which we have this very contentious kind of situation where, I don't know, obviously there are some very toxic examples of things where we'll see men in certain situations say, well, I don't understand what the problem is, or they behave in ways they think that they're not behaving in a certain way, but they are. And similarly, there may be cases where you may have a perfectly normal coming together of a relationship, but because of various factors, the relationship is automatically denigrated. So for instance, if you have somebody, let's just say you have a couple who are together and there's a big age difference between them. I tend to think of my sister and her husband. I think they met when she was 20 or 21, and he was 32 or 33. Nowadays, people would say, "Oh, well, that's terrible. He's grooming her." There's no such thing went on, and their relationship has not and has never been like that. So, point being is not so much about. It's not meant to be a discussion of relationships where you have one partner's older and one is younger. It's the perception that men are always trying to groom women, or that women are, that having any kind of, a younger woman having any kind of relationship with an older man, or maybe an older woman, I don't know, by example, is somehow, it's always going to be something suspect. And obviously, context is very important here. But my whole point is that we're at a point where we just simply assume that any dynamic where a man approaches a woman is going to be suspect. And there are many of them that are. And men may sit there. A lot of men are turning to. I'm reading a lot in the Pew surveys about how a lot of young men are now turning back to very conservative forms of organized religion, for example, because they feel, they feel like somehow this is how they're going to reclaim a power that they have. And then you have this whole ideas about the alpha males and, some of these ridiculous ideas about, the man who is going to, make that woman submit to him and so forth. And these ideas are all really, really badly out of date. And I don't think that the answer going forward is that, never the twain shall meet again. And of course, obviously, we are also considering, gay and lesbian relationships and, other relationships, transgender relationships and things like that may not fall into the typical, what we always treat as the standard male-female categories, or at least those categories do not manifest themselves in the same way as somebody who we think of, and I'm going to use this term advisedly, understanding that there are people who are going to say to me, it's not always what you think it is, but people who we tend to think of as biologically male and then biologically female. Okay. And I realize that there could be a lot of complications even in that definition, but I think it's understood where we're just going to take as our jumping off point to talk about this masculine-feminine merging idea. Now, as always, when I'm talking about this, this is not a way of saying that, I see a lot about women needing to go back to be feminine or men having to be more masculine. I don't think anybody really understands what it means to be masculine and feminine in that sense. You're talking about gender roles. You're not talking about genuine qualities of masculinity and femininity. Okay, you're not talking about the same thing. So we're going to look here in the myth of Hermaphroditus at what this myth actually says about the merging of the masculine and feminine. And yes, certainly this has been talked about in terms of intersex beings, which have always been around. I mean, the idea that somehow people who are either transgender or born in a situation where they are dual-sexed in some fashion, whether that's always obvious or not, that has been a thing that's been around for a long time. And I believe this myth addresses the fact that, perhaps such beings were there. The book that I often refer to is Anthony Corbet's, it was called Sexing the World, about how the Romans were very particular about assigning gender to words and gendering words regardless of what their actual linguistic gender was. So, for example, a noun like deus, which means God, if you were referring to a female deity, you would say dea. You would add the feminine ending, even though the word itself is not a feminine word. There's like this shifting around depending on what the gender is of the being that you're speaking to. This is not necessarily something that happens in other contexts. If it's a masculine word by gender, because each gendered case in Latin, the first declension is feminine, the second declension is masculine, and there's other ones that are neuter when you get into third IO, fourth, fifth. I mean, there's some different permutations there, but the idea is that that's a masculine word, that's a feminine word, that's just what it is. And the Romans were the first to say, well, no, if we're referring to a feminine person, deity, being, then we're going to feminize the word. And similarly, if we're referring to a masculine being and it's a feminine word, we're going to masculinize the word. Okay. And the Romans were also the ones who had written about hermaphroditic people who were dual-sexed, and and their perceptions of that and what that meant. So we're going to talk a little bit about that because this also connects in with ideas about marriage and what does it mean to be married and what is marriage besides a social arrangement. Plato talks about this, about what he has his own mythology of dual-sexed beings that he sees as an origin story for marriage, or even just for love and for romance and for coming together. So we're going to go through all of this. So without any further ado, I'm going to read to you from Ovid's Metamorphoses. So the characters at play here, the teenage boy who is later called Hermaphroditus, who is, because he is the son of Hermes or Hermes and Aphrodite. Okay? So, or Mercury and Venus, if you will. The two of them mate, and they have this beautiful son. And he goes to bathe in this particular pool of water where he encounters the nymph who has the divine power over that pool, and her name is Salmacis. So these are the characters that we're looking at. And I should also note that sometimes Hermaphroditus is called Atlantides, which means, I think I'm saying that correctly, but basically because Hermes' mother, the god Hermes' mother, is a nymph called Maia, and Maia's father is Atlas, the Titan god who holds the world up on his shoulders. So sometimes Hermaphroditus is referred to as like the son of Atlas. Atlantides, I think is how you say it. When I see the word, I'll probably say it more correctly. But it's the idea of Hermaphroditus as being the son of Atlas. So here we go. Here's the story. This is translated by Melville. Okay. Hear how the magic pool of Salmacis found its ill fame, and why its strengthless waters soften and enervate the limbs they touch. Okay, we'll get into what that means. All know its famous power, but few the cause. To Mercurius or Mercury or Hermes runs the tale, and Cytherea, Venus or Aphrodite, a boy, Hermaphroditus, was born, whom in Mount Ida's caves the Naiads nurtured. In his face he showed father and mother, and took his name from both. When thrice 5 years had passed, the youth forsook Ida, his fostering home, his mountain haunts, eager to roam strange lands afar, to see strange rivers, hardships softened by delight. The town of Lycia he reached at last, and Carrhae's marching provinces. There he saw a pool, a limpid shining pool, clear to its very bottom, no marsh reed, no barren sedge grew there, no spiky rush, the water crystal clear, its margin ringed with living tuft and verdure always green. A nympha dwelt there, not one to bend the bow or join the hunt, or to run to win the race, in other words, not connected to Artemis or Diana. She was the only one of the Naiads unknown to swift Diana. Many a time her sisters chide her, "Come, Salmacis, get out your spear or painted quiver, vary your hours of ease with hardships of the chase." Okay, now that's interesting too, because the connection to Artemis here and the fact that she is reluctant to take on the ways of Artemis, I think is significant. Yet never spear she took, nor painted quiver, nor would vary her hours of ease with hardships of the chase, but in her pool would bathe her lovely limbs, and with a comb of boxwood dress her hair, and gazing long take counsel of the waters, what style were best. Now on the soft green grass, or on the soft leaves in gauzy dress, she lay, now gathered flowers, and gathering chanced to see the boy, seeing saw her heart's desire. Yet though her heart would haste, she paused a while, till dress inspected, all in order placed, charm in her eyes set shining, she deserved to look so lovely, then began to speak. "Fair boy, you seem, how worthily you seem, a god, and if a god, Cupido, a love, or Eros himself, or if a mortal, happy pair are they who gave birth to you. Blessed is your brother, blessed indeed is your sister, if you have one, and the nurse who suckled you, but far more blessed she, your betrothed, found worthy of your love. If there is one, let stolen joy be mine, if none, let me be her, make me your bride." This said, she held her peace. A rosy blush dyed the boy's cheeks. He knew not what love was, but blushes well became him, like the bloom of rosy apples hanging in the sun, or painted ivory, or when the moon glows red beneath her pallor, and the gongs resound in vain to rescue her eclipse. Then Nympha pleaded, begged, besought at least a sister's kiss, and made to throw her arms around his ivory neck. "Enough," he cried. "Have done, or I shall quit this place and you." Fear struck her heart. "I yield the place," she said, "stranger to you," and turned away as if to leave him. Then, with many a backward glance, she vanished into the leafy undergrowth and crouched in hiding there. The boy, alone, he thought, on the empty sward, unobserved, strolled to and fro, and in the rippling water dipped first his toes, then ankle deep, and soon, charmed by the soothing coolness of the pool, stripped his light garments from his slender limbs. Then Salmacis gazed spellbound, and desire flamed for his naked beauty, and her eyes blazed bright as when the sun's unclouded orb shines dazzling in a mirror. She scarce could bear to wait, hardly postpone her joy. She longed to embrace him. Scarce contained her frenzied heart. He clapped his hollow palms against his sides and dived into the pool, and as we swam arm over arm, gleamed in the limpid water like, in a guarding dome of crystal glass, white lilies or a figure of ivory. "I've won, he's mine," she cried, and flung aside her clothes and plunged far out into the pool and grappled him, and as he struggled, forced her kisses willy-nilly, fondled him, caressed him, now on one side, now on the other, clung to him as he fought to escape her, hold, and so at last entwined him like a snake seized by the king of birds and borne aloft, which as it hangs, coils round his head and claws with its tail entwines his spreading wings, or ivy wrapping round tall forest trees, or in the sea a squid whose whipping arm sees from every side surround their prey. Atlantiades, that's the right way to say it, or Hermaphroditus, fought back, denied the nymph her joy. She strained the more. Her clinging body seemed fixed fast to his. "Fool, fight me as you will," she cried, "you'll not escape. Ye gods ordain no day shall ever dawn to part us twain." Her prayer found gods to hear. Both bodies merged into one, both blended in one form and face. As when a gardener sets a graft and sees growth seal the join and both mature together, thus when the fast embrace of their limbs were knit, they two were no more, nor man nor woman, one body, then that neither seemed, and both. So when he saw the waters of the pool where he had dived a man, had rendered him half woman and his limbs now weak and soft, raising his hands, Hermaphroditus cried, his voice unmanned, "Dear father Hermes and dear mother Aphrodite, both of whose names I bear, grant me, your child, that whoso in these waters bathes, a man emerge, half woman, weakened instantly. Both parents here, both moved to gratify their bisexed son, his purpose to ensure, drugged the bright water with that power impure." Okay, so very interesting, right? Now, it's worth remembering that with Ovid, we are talking about a metamorphosis. Like, that is literally the point of the entire work. It's these metamorphoses, people turning into, in this case, you've got a man and a woman merging together, or a boy and a girl, if you will, merging together. And then you also have, you have people being turned into trees and, things like that. I mean, metamorphosis is about people changing. The Miniatis turning into bats. It's about the metamorphosis from one state to another. It's a shape-shifting or a blending or a moving is what all of these stories are about. And many of them are retellings of Greek tales. Now, okay, this is interesting because Hermaphroditus is... Okay, so we see that now he has become part of the body of Salmacis. Now, he's also explained as being one of the Erotes, which were the gods of love. It's the multiplication of the god Eros. And I'm reading a little bit about the Erotes here quickly. Hesiod describes a pair, Eros, love, and Hemeros, desire, who were present at the birth of Aphrodite. Now, this has got to be the original Eros, because we often see Eros listed as the son of Aphrodite. But there is actually a primal Eros. So it's Eros and Hemeros, while the later writers add a third, Porthos, passion, to create a triad of Goldings. Twin Erotes, Eros, love, and Anteros, love reciprocated, were often portrayed gracing the scales of love. The lyric poets multiplied them into a numberless host of winged putti. The Erotes were purely creatures of poetic invention with no distinct mythology of their own. Now, the names of them, we've mentioned a couple of them, but there's Anteros, the god of mutual love, Eros, the god of love and procreation. There's two of them. That's the ancient one. Then there's Eros II. He was the god of love and the most mischievous. He's the one who we would equate more to Cupid, taking his bow and arrow and shooting it. The original Eros was born at the creation of the universe and is not the same as this second Eros. There's Hedilogos, the god of sweet talk and flattery, and Hermaphroditus, hermaphroditic god, once a handsome winged youth like the other Erotes, but his form was merged with that of the nymph Salmacis in answer to her prayers. So, okay, and so really, Hermaphroditus was considered to be one of the Erotes. So when Salmacis says to him, "You must be a god," or "You must be connected to Eros," interestingly, in this mythology, or at least in literary devices, Hermaphroditus is considered to be one of the Erotes, one of these winged creatures that has to do with desire and love. And so you have flattery, Hemeros, the god of sexual desire, who accompanied Aphrodite. Hymenaeus, god of the wedding ceremony, and Pothos, the god of passionate longing. So as you can see, the erotes have a lot to do with not only the idea of marriage, but also the idea of love, longing, desire. And the original eros as a god of procreation, we can think of it as the libido of the universe. It's like the drive. It's the drive to create, to take something in this chaos, in the realm of chaos, and it's a drive to action. So really, it's interesting. It's a masculine force because if we think about the masculine as active, okay, Eros is portrayed as male because it is an active driving force, even though the love goddess herself is female. Okay, there's the idea of the primal Eros as being the drive to create in the universe. So now we have this particular story of Hermaphroditus. Now, certainly the way Ovid tells it, there's a certain inflection there that seems to imply that this pool of water is a danger of some kind. The implication is that a man who bathes in these particular waters sacred to Salmacis, who now becomes Hermaphroditus, that he is now it's like he's emasculated. His limbs become quote-unquote soft, okay? That the man is emasculated. And when we see this story of Salmacis, this nymph who very aggressively attacks him, this isn't a case of the man, aggressively going after the woman. It's this nymph who aggressively goes after the man. Now, nymphs tend to have this, just like we have the term nymphomaniac, right? You tend to have this idea of nymphs as being very erotic kind of creatures in and of themselves. They're creatures of water. Water is often associated with emotion. So the nymphs have this, this kind of, this very aggressive sexual drive. And Salmacis certainly, the fact that she does not want to engage in the pursuits of the other nymphs connected to Diana or Artemis, who is connected very strongly to virginity and chastity, suggests the very kind of sexualized nature. And the fact that she is consumed with beautifying herself, with making her hair look a certain way. It's all of these attributes of femininity that are about about attraction, about wanting to be desirable, wanting to look desirable to the others, wanting to, I guess you could say, entrap the animus, but trying to seduce really is probably the correct word. When we see what she does to Hermaphroditus, he initially, he is kind of like a virgin boy. He has no idea. He's just going out into the world. And this woman very aggressively and assertively approaches him, this nymph, and he is just like, hey, back off. But then he goes and acts, he's taken in by this pool that is actually sacred to her. So as soon as he dives in, she has power over him. And when he tries to resist her advances, she declares that the two of them should become merged. Okay, so there's a couple of different ways. There's probably many ways you could look at this story, but I'm going to take as a jumping off point a couple of different articles, okay? Now, the first one is by Peter Kelly, and it's called Intersex and Intertext, Ovid's Hermaphroditus and the Early Universe. And this is from Edinburgh University Press. And what he talks about in this particular article, or this particular discussion of this, he says Ovid uses Hermaphroditus narrative not only to collapse the distinction between gender categories or apparent ones, but also to question the notion that it is possible to hold a fixed and stable view of both the cosmos and the literary text purporting to depict it. So they're talking about the idea of, okay, and when he starts talking about the primal idea of the universe, now he goes back to the idea that, let me find it in here. At the beginning of Metamorphoses, okay, Ovid describes chaos, the primordial state of the universe, as follows, and he has it in Latin. I'll just read the English translation for you. Before the sea and the lands and the sky, which covers all things, there was one face of nature in her whole globe, which they called chaos. A rough, unordered mass, nothing except inactive weight, and joined together the discordant steeds of badly joined together things. To none did its form remain, and one impeded the others, because in one body the cold were fighting with the hot, the wet with the dry, the soft with the hard, the weightless with the heavy. Okay, now this also gets back to a series of categories that does come out of Platonic or even Aristotelian thinking about what the elements are, and they talk about things having a certain type of substance. Are they moist or dry? Are they hot? Is it actually wet? Wet and dry, hot and cold. That these were opposites, and that they were in a chaotic state. They're both existing at the same time, but in battle with each other, which is interesting, rather than being united with each other. Now he also mentions here in this the idea that when Hermaphroditus and Salmacis merge, the way that it's actually described in Ovid. And I'm going to read, again, I'm not going to read the Latin, I will just read the translation. For their two bodies were mingled and joined, and they put on the appearance of one, just as if someone put branches through a tree's bark. He sees them as joined together, growing and maturing together, so when their bodies had come together in a clinging embrace, they were not two, but they had a dual form that could be said to be neither woman nor boy. They seem to be neither and both. And he says their two bodies fuse together and adopt a single appearance, and yet have a dual form. They no longer appear to operate within normative conceptual distinctions. They are neither fully singular nor plural. They are neither individually male or female, nor are they both. In being neither and both, the woman and the boy, the distinction of they, she no longer holds. No longer do we see a breakdown in perceived gender divisions, but the distinction necessary for individual identity to exist, as well as our ability to describe and conceptualize its loss. And so he's comparing this to the primordial stage of the universe. But one of the interesting things about this is that Salmacis, the way that it's often described is that she actually disappears in this. So even though they are now one, it's not like the image that we see, for instance, in Hinduism of Sri Ardhanarishwara, which is a half Shiva, half Shakti figure, right? That's the merging of masculine and feminine, where they were basically Shiva grants that Shakti should be merged into his body. And so when you look at them, it's like you see half of a female form and half of a male form. In this case, they're saying, no, it's almost like Salmacis dissolves into him. And there's some discussion here about sexual intercourse and the way in which it occurs. And there's a certain passage here where I think it's in Lucretius. So he talks about the sexual act, and he describes in Durirum Natura, Lucretius describes how lovers during intercourse strive to completely join as a single body. And he says, it's all a waste of effort, as they cannot rub any bit of it away, nor can they get right inside of that body and make their whole body disappear in it. For sometimes this is what they seem to want to do and strive for, which is interesting. So it's the idea that in the act of intercourse, that one, even though you have two beings that are trying to come together, you have male and female coming together, there's never a total merging there that goes on. One does not dissolve into the other. But the implication is that's what happens with Salmacis, in the sense that she completely somehow dissolves into Hermaphroditus, who does take on some of these feminine characteristics, but it seems that it's more him than her somehow in the final analysis. Now, this is interesting too. Okay, so let's stop and look at Plato for a minute, because he talks about Plato's proto-humans. And this is another myth that comes out of Plato's Symposium. And just to summarize that myth, basically what Plato says is that when you have, that you initially had human beings that were, men and women were merged. And how is it described? It says there was he's also quoting Aristophanes here too. They were spherical in shape. The form of each human was round, with backs and sides forming a circle. They had double-formed bodies, along with 4 arms and 4 legs. They had 2 faces on a single head. There was a single head for both faces, which faced in opposite directions. And they were comparing this also to the Janus figure, or Portinus, which are these gods that their heads face in 2 different directions, which we often interpret as looking both backwards and forwards, both past and future, right? But in this conception, you have this idea of the proto-human being a single, masculine and feminine, but a single gender with 4 arms, 4 legs, and 2 faces. And what's said in Plato's story is that beings like this were a threat to Zeus in some way. Like, he found them to be too powerful, maybe even having the potential to overthrow the gods as a combination of masculine and feminine. So he separated them. And that what Plato says, he connects love or romantic longing and desire with the desire to reconnect these two halves that have been broken apart. So again, this works in heterosexual relationships, right? I mean, how that would fit in homosexual relationships, which, by the way, were normative in ancient Greece. You don't want to. A lot of people try to say people who try to say that's a more modern thing. No, it was definitely a thing there. So Plato doesn't really explain how that fits in, but he suggests that the longing to come together and to procreate has to do with this idea that these proto-humans need to come back together. And what's interesting, in Symposium, he says that the proto-humans are the offspring of three major cosmic bodies: the male, the child of the sun, the female of the earth, and the female male of the moon, which shares the nature of both the moon and the earth. So that's interesting, because if you have a hermaphroditic being, or this proto-human that is both male and female, it's not that one side is the sun and one's the moon, or one's the sun and one's the earth. It's actually one is the moon and one is the earth, as though the masculine there loses its solar nature, which is somewhat interesting to consider. Now, I'm gonna move on to a different article here, but think about this as the idea, if we're thinking about love, marriage, procreation, if that coming together in desire, okay, whether it's for the purposes of what we think of as legal marriage or not, the idea that this is somehow a state of beings or a state of things, Plato feels that it comes out of these proto-humans that were separated. And obviously, this is a myth that Plato has made up. I mean, we're not suggesting that any of these things actually happened, but I think what it does is it suggests it gets back to the idea of duality. And when we think about that in connection with the Janus figure as looking both backwards and forwards, again, this is what I have said often about creation myths, that there is an initial connection, there's initial lack of separation, and the condition for life is that these things that are united have to be separated. The way that Ovid is describing chaos, it's like, well, you have all these elements and they're merged into one, but even as they're merged into one, it's like they are at odds with each other. Like they need to be, they're stormy. They need to be cut apart. Okay, and when I say stormy, I mean in the way, for example, when you have a lightning storm, that hot and cold air mass comes together, and then you have this kind of explosion, right? So the idea is that chaos is this kind of exploding realm or exploding kind of way of being that is that was what the result of all of these things kind of being together. And I have talked about in Hesiod's version of the Theogony, when you have Uranus and Gaia mating, and Uranus like stuffing the children back into Gaia. You know what I mean? Like stuffing his children back in to the earth. There's this shame of what's coming out of this union of opposites, so to speak, and then eventually Kronos comes as the god of time and separates the two of them. So obviously now we are talking about a space where we are dealing with time. So existing as humans and as separate, we're existing in the field of time. If you think about the Adam and Eve story, right? What is it? They don't know that they're different. There's no difference between them until they eat the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In other words, this fruit that opens their eyes to the dual nature of things. And as Joseph Campbell has pointed out, there is the insight of duality and the insight that transcends duality, which is one of the essential differences between Eastern and Western religion. Eastern religion talks about the insight that transcends duality. It sees the dualism as Maya, as illusion. In Western religion, everything is about duality. Oh, the original quote-unquote fall of man, which, again, that's a whole other side subject that I can talk about, but nonetheless, the idea is that at the moment that Adam and Eve eat that fruit, they know that they are different. And so now they are functioning as, even though they are human and wife, there's this conception that Eve comes out of the rib of Adam, is taken out of him. And that's interesting too, if we think about this particular mythology and we see that Salmacis somehow becomes part of the body of Hermaphroditus. It's not like the other way around. So this also raises some questions about this myth and ideas about marriage. So I want to flip over to this other story because this gives a different view of it. And this is from Alan Romano, The Invention of Marriage, Hermaphroditus and Salmacis at Halicarnassus and in Ovid. And this is from the Classical Quarterly, December 2009. He talks about the story that Ovid tells, and of course what we know, the idea, as he says, in Ovid's account, the daughters of the Minyas, toiling on their looms while the other women Boeotia dutifully observed the rites of Dionysus, tell a series of stories about love, including the story of how the rapacious nymph Salmacis tried to seduce the handsome and chaste youth Hermaphroditus. By the end of the story, Hermaphroditus has been transformed into a hermaphrodite, and the spring of Salmacis has been given an emasculating power. Now, in 1995, a Greek poetic inscription dated to the 2nd century BCE and found at the very site of the spring Salmacis the Salmacis spring in Halicarnassus revealed a different account. So again, I'm not going to read the Greek, but I will read you the translation of what the inscription says. Halicarnassus settles the lovely hill beside the stream of Salmacis, called dear to the immortals in song, and she occupies the lovely home of the nymph, who once took our boy in her sweet embrace and raised him, Hermaphroditus, to be outstanding, he who discovered marriage and was first to bind the marriage bed in law. And she herself, Salmacis, beneath the holy streams, dripping in the cave, tames the savage minds of men. Okay, so this is a really different inflection of this story. So now if we want to look at the two of them as representing, say, anima and animus, representing different aspects of the soul, she definitely has the qualities of an anima, right? Because she is somebody who is powerfully sexual, who is a seducer, who is desirous. And he similarly has this kind of, he's considered to be a chaste boy, but there's this, there's almost this innocent quality there. There's this idea of her as the beautiful form, and the animus is the one that is kind of a judging or reasoning kind of force. Sometimes Jung would say an opinionated kind of force. Now, truthfully, we don't know whether Hermaphroditus found Salmacis attractive or not. We just know that he didn't know what this whole business about sexuality was, and he was just kind of like, I don't want to be a part of this. So it's almost like we see the idea here that Salmacis they're exploring the idea in this article of Salmacis as nurturing or raising Hermaphroditus. But I would say what this actually means is it's the old expression of the girl who turns a boy into a man, right? It's the idea that she is, by her sexual power, taking him out of this state of chaste innocence. And in a way, it's almost the reverse of Persephone and Hades, where Persephone is the chaste young girl who still follows Artemis, and Hades, after being hit by one of Eros's arrows, desires her and just scoops her up and takes her away. And I've often said that this represents this kind of sweeping of the girl into puberty, into a life where now she's no longer a girl, but now she is a woman who's all the mysteries of reproduction are now active, right? And it makes her a different type of a being. Physically, women change and everything else. Similarly, men go through the same kind of a thing. Men's their testicles drop, their voices change. There's kind of the development of the Adam's apple that's what they call it, in the kind of in the esophageal area. And so, and that's when boys start to have sexual feelings. They may start to have, nocturnal emissions and things. All of these things that are connected to the normal adolescent change of life. And we have to remember that Hermaphroditus is an adolescent, and Salmacis is more like the experienced older woman. So this is almost like a flip side of that. But what happens in this particular myth, as opposed to Persephone and Hades, where interestingly that separation is maintained. Persephone is the queen of the underworld, but for a certain number of days in the year, she is able to come up to the earth and be with her mother, throughout the spring and through the summer. And then through the other seasons, the colder seasons, she's back in the underworld, where she rules as queen. And actually, she takes a more active role, where Hades takes a more passive role. And of course, this is not the same as this in the sense that the two are not merged as a unit, right? They're still two separate beings. Now, Interestingly, in this particular version, it's where the feminine, in her seduction of the masculine, the two of them become entangled. Like there's no separation. And in one sense, you could look at it as an emasculation. But in the other sense, they're saying this is the woman who grows the boy up. Okay? The boy is grown up through the advances of the experienced and rather aggressive woman. So, but here in this inscription, it says it tames savage minds. So here we're getting to an idea actually of marriage, or what people would say about the institution of marriage, that people are married to each other to tame the natural instincts. So if you have him grow up into being a young man who is, wants to, sow his oats or feeling his oats. There's different expressions about that, different euphemisms for that. But the idea that by taking him and while he is still chaste and kind of binding him into a marriage, again, the reverse situation of what we typically would see with women, right? Where the virginal girl is not supposed to be out, engaging with various men. She's supposed to be, brought up into a chaste marriage, right? Well, here now we have the boy being brought into the chaste marriage, so to speak, in the sense that the two become one. Now, we're not going to talk about the social, ethical, realistic human implications of marriage, where I would say that you have two people who come together, and they are building a life together and perhaps procreating together, perhaps, not necessarily. But assuming that they do, it's not a case that the two just become one unit. They do a lot of things together as a unit, but they are still two separate people with separate interests. Here you have somebody who is completely merged. And the idea is that the merging of this anima figure with Hermaphroditus is something that it makes him, it tames perhaps the more dangerous instincts of masculinity. How they always talk about men, quote unquote, being unable to control themselves in the face of temptation. The idea that this is a taming force of that drive, of the male drive, which actually Hermaphroditus had not even encountered yet. And it's interesting that as he is merged with her, what he declares is that anybody who should swim in that pool of water will meet the same fate. Now, why would he do that? It's a very strange kind of a request. And I don't know. And it's not really clearly stated how Hermaphroditus, now recognizing himself as being, not quite what he was before, and now being merged with this nymph, something that he fought. But, so there's almost this idea of the person who fights off proper marriage, right? Who fights off the this kind of enforced chastity, as we'll call it, where now you have committed yourself to one person as a bride or as a bridegroom, and now you are, that is who you are bound to, right? So it's interesting that the inscription from the 2nd century is actually that this is what really they're interpreting this story as the binding of marriage in sacred law. In other words, the two become one. And you actually do see this in marriage vows. I've seen it certainly in Christian marriage vows, where people will say, well, the two that have been separate are now united. They're now one. And that gets back to Plato's implication of those two halves that have been separated are now reunited. And in that state, that's when they are able to create other life and other beings that may then, in theory, unite with other beings. So, though it says here, a far cry from Ovid's chaste boy and lustful girl, the Salmacis inscription, we find Salmacis the nurturing nymph and Hermaphroditus the lawgiver, which is interesting. So, yeah, almost like she is now subsumed into him, and so she tames him, but now it's like almost like he is the master of her. But in this is the softening of the limbs. And think about this. Think about how we have these conceptions of marriage in song and jokes and the old ball and chain. Now that he's the men who were just kind of like, oh no, they're their wild ways now have to be tamed because now they have to be a husband and a father, and they have to do all these very civilized things. So it's almost like the feral nature of the masculine and feminine now being tamed in their union with each other, that it kind of calms the impulses of both to have them united. And that's a rather interesting idea. The idea that that the real potency of sexuality is somehow tamed or managed or tempered by that particular union. Now, obviously, when we talk about hermaphrodites as representing dual-sexed people or people who are intersexed, which again is something that's not something recent. That is something that has always kind of been, and different cultures have had different views of it. If we think about it in a literal physical sense, these people were referred to as hermaphrodites because it's a reference to this particular tale where you have both the masculine and feminine in one body. And the Romans tended to view that as a kind of an omen of sorts when the two came together. Frequently, these children who were born that way I hate to say it, some of them were considered to be cursed. And I'm not suggesting that I think they are cursed, but there was this idea that, or that they represented some kind of, they could either represent some kind of a real boon or some kind of a danger. Because again, if you go back to Plato's idea that when the two are united in that way, that they represent something that somehow is proto-human, something that actually transcends, that goes back almost to that titanic power, that kind of chaotic power that was there before you have the battle between the Titans and what we think of now as the Olympians, who are solar in inflection, by the way. And so it's interesting that Plato talks about the hermaphrodite as a being of moon and earth, whereas you have the Olympians, the 12, who are, the cult of the 12 represents a solar kind of, it's a kind of a solar system. It's a solar, the solar system, right? It's a solar, it represents deities of the daytime. Deus is related to the word for day, for daylight, for sun. But these beings are somehow not connected to the sun. They're like a merging of moon and earth. And earth, of course, I have the entire book talking about the associations of earth, but earth tends to have these strong feminine associations that we've talked about that are connected to sexuality, fertility, sowing and reaping, things like that. And then you also have the moon element, which we tend to think of as feminine, but we connect with the emotional. It does get connected to water because of its influence on the tides. So we tend to think of it as being kind of an emotional thing. But it's also not the full strength of the sun. It's like the tempered light because moonlight reflects sunlight. So if the sun represents masculinity, a moon-earth being would be one where its masculinity is tempered in some way, or in some way it's diminished. So I think this is interesting, and I often wonder if this idea of this merging, even when you're talking about this happening in a proper marital relationship, because think also about the fact that in a quote-unquote proper civilized marriage, how often cheating becomes a problem. How often you have these stereotypes of the man who is the philanderer, like Zeus is a good example of it, right? Or you have the woman who henpecks her husband, or the, you just have these different negative stereotypes of marriage, of what it means to be merged, of two people not being in their full power because, their full sexual power because they have tempered it in their union with each other. And so therefore, by extension, there's almost this attitude that a hermaphroditic being is one that sort of has the elements of both, but somehow is perceived as weaker than the masculine and the feminine, kind of in their own particular, in their own right, in their own individual state. However, remember too what Plato is saying about the idea that the hermaphrodite was a threat to the gods, that somehow this being of moon and earth is more powerful potentially than the sun, which is quite interesting. And it's, I don't know, it'd be interesting to kind of get into why that might be the case, especially if those things are perceived to be lesser, or maybe there's a perception that a being like this would somehow lessen the power of the sun or challenge it in some way. This being that is moon and earth connected, creating a different kind of a way of being. Now, if we go back to our associations with masculine and feminine, as I'm thinking this through, if we think of the masculine as yang energy, okay, going back to yin and yang, right? That's just, I think, the thing that people can identify with the most. And the masculine as active, rational, intellectual, hot, heat rather than cold, is associated with the sun, whereas the feminine or the yin energy tends to be associated with passivity, with emotions, with intuition, with the cooler side of things, with one where it's where one isn't necessarily active, simply allows things to happen rather than actively trying to move forward and to do them. And when you have these two kind of things that merge together, it's interesting because moon, if we think about moon as implying all of those things, it gives the moon kind of a feminine bent. It doesn't put things in the full light of analysis, right? Not in the full light of the sun. But it's almost like this is a being that knows things without having to separate them, without having to analyze them, that can exist in a way as a paradox, where all opposites are one or are united. A state of mind that, as we are separated, that we cannot conceive of. As 3D beings in the body that we are, we use our intellect as our primary tool. Maybe that's the reason for Plato's distinction there, because he certainly privileges rationality as the way of knowing truth, and perhaps suggests a being like that, whatever truth it knows, it's more the truth of the underworld, or it's more the truth of what is intuited without being evaluated. Okay, so interesting things to think about with regard to this particular being. Would love to know other people's thoughts on it. Thank you so much for listening. If you did enjoy this episode, and if you do enjoy this podcast, you can please consider joining my Patreon. I did thank my patrons at the beginning of the episode, but it's patreon.com/Chthonia. I am still on social media, mainly Instagram and Facebook as Chthonia Podcast. And of course, if you're watching this on YouTube, then you know I'm at Chthonia Podcast, one word, on YouTube. But also, that is also my handle on Instagram. And on Facebook, it's Chthonia Podcast, 2 words. And do also check out the Institute for the Study of Feminine Myth, instituteforfemininemyth.org. And that should also be in the description below this, if it's in the video. I do have that there. But the school, we are doing a Thinker's Tavern series this summer, which should be very interesting and very inexpensive. It's only $10 a pop to join for a 2-hour session, where it's going to be mainly discussion that's going to be framed by a facilitator, usually me. But we're going to be doing that. And also there'll be a research emergence of Scholars of the Borderland, which was my asynchronous online school for people who just wanted to take classes whenever. I'm going to put that material up as well. So a few new things coming up this summer. So I hope you can check all those out. Thank you again for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.